There is so much deer activity in this small part of the forest that entire sections of the ground have been transformed into mud pits that are absolutely littered with deer tracks at all times of year. And today, I'm not only going to show you how to find your own secret deer tracking hotspots, but I'm also going to show you 4 different levels of deer trail visibility in the forest. I spent the first few years of my tracking journey absolutely struggling to follow deer tracks in the forest, and it wasn't until I had the experience of studying their trails through a full spectrum of forest conditions that I really started to make progress with tracking deer. So I'm going to show you a complete progression of what deer tracks look like in the forest from beginner to advanced levels. And we're starting here at the intersection point between the main human trail and a very well used deer trail that crosses over it. If we look closely, there are so many deer using this exact spot to cross over the trail that it's actually left a permanent mark on the vegetation. They're going in both directions, and especially in a few weeks when the does start moving around with their fawns, there are going to be fresh tracks here almost every single day. So this type of high activity intersection point is really the ideal place to start tracking deer in the forest, especially in the beginner stages when one of your biggest challenges is just being able to see the tracks and know that you're on a fresh trail. First of all, seeing this is going to give you clear confirmation that you're actually looking in an area that has lots of deer activity. Second, the fact that these crossing points occur along the main human trail provides us with an efficient way to scout through the forest and identify key locations like this one. If you've never seen something like this in your forest, it's important to make sure that you're searching over a wide enough area and taking the deer habitat into consideration, because these intersection points are a common thing, but you're not always going to just randomly stumble across them unless you're actually looking. When I go on scouting missions to try and find deer trails in a new forest, I will sometimes spend hours just hiking around and getting to know the lay of the land before I find my first really good trail that looks clear like this. So deer are what's known as an edge species, which means you're going to have the greatest success at finding their trails when you look around the edges of distinct habitats like forests that border open fields or wetlands or neighborhoods with human landscaping. And this combination of habitats gives them access to a wider diversity of food while also having access to the safety and cover of the forest. The other thing to consider is how much moisture there is in the soil and how quickly things are drying out. When I first started following deer trails, I found that I was only really able to see their tracks clearly when there was enough moisture in the ground and when evaporation was at a minimum. So cloudy days immediately following a nice soaking rain is the ideal time to see deer tracks in forest substrates. But as you get more experienced, you won't always need such ideal conditions, because the whole goal here is that we learn to see the trail in progressively more challenging conditions, which brings us to our next step on the journey to being a master tracker of deer. So whenever you find clear deer trails like this, the number one most important thing that you can do is simply to follow them, because it's really from following deer through the forest over and over again that you learn how to track. And we're starting here at a point where things are fairly easy to see, but if we actually follow this trail, very quickly you'll notice that the tracks start to become much less obvious, and usually it doesn't take too long before the deer will take you into a place where you can no longer clearly see the individual tracks, but what you can see is an overall route of travel. So what we're looking at here is an area of movement that gets so much traffic from deer that it actually changes the vegetation patterns and leaves a mark on the forest that can be quite easy to see. This is what wildlife trackers call a run, and these are habitual trails that have lots of deer using them, but if you look at the ground, it can actually be really difficult to see individual tracks, even if the trail has been recently used. So these runs are great for scouting activity and getting an overall sense of how the deer populations move through your forest. They can also provide a fast and effective way to locate fresh signs of deer in your forest, because very often there are parts of these trails that do register clear tracks. This little muddy spot in particular was created by a deer scrape back in the fall during their rut time, a male deer came through and scraped away the leaves at this location and left his scent for breeding females and rival males. But as a result, it also created this special little mud trap that actually shows the tracks a lot better than the rest of the trail. And this is significant because this can help you assess the relative freshness of movement on the trail. So if you think about the overall strategy when tracking deer in the forest, it all starts with finding the freshest trails to follow. And for me, the way that I do this is with a tracking circuit that I try to walk at least once per week through my forest. Over time, I've gotten to know a bunch of key intersections and runs that I make a point of visiting every time I come out. Sometimes I come through here and this deer scrape has a bunch of new tracks that weren't here before, but then other times I come through and there just isn't that much happening. But overall, if I check on 10 different trails scattered around my forest, I can usually count on finding fresh tracks in at least one of these locations. And sometimes just following these runs can actually get you pretty far. I've had many experiences of being able to follow deer for hundreds of feet along these runs in not half bad tracking conditions. You might not be able to see every single track, but if you look ahead on the trail, there's enough to pick it back up and start closing the gap between you and those deer. But eventually, the deer are going to step off the main run, and when they do, it's important that you're able to see this change and know what to look for, because I can't tell you how many times I've been following a fresh deer trail, seeing the tracks, and making really great progress when all of a sudden, almost like magic, the trail just seems to vanish, and it really is almost as though deer have this ability to simply disappear into thin air. But this is actually where we have our next big opportunity to take our tracking skills onto the next level. So this is a deer track in leaf litter, and for years I remember seeing little impressions like this on the forest floor and just not really knowing whether it was a track or a squirrel burying a nut or just some random variation in the leaves. And it wasn't until I started putting a lot more practice into following deer along their runs and seeing what happens when they step into different parts of the forest that I realized many of these choppy looking textures on the forest floor really are deer tracks. And it was simply that I hadn't trained my brain to process what my eyes were already capable of seeing. So at first I often came back from the forest feeling like I really didn't see many tracks at all, except maybe in the muddy spots. But with practice, I started seeing deer tracks in a much wider variety of substrates until eventually it got to the point where I would look at the ground in some places and be almost overwhelmed by the amount of tracks that I could see. I'd be following trails and it felt like I had so many options in front of me that it was actually really difficult to sort out which is the trail that I'm following and what are the other trails from days or even weeks ago. Then with more experience, I learned to refine and actually discern what is a fresh deer track and what is an old deer track. So the key to continue developing your skills at these more advanced levels is to pay very close attention to how tracks age. It was particularly revealing to me when I would see a track on day one thinking it was super fresh, but then if I came back a few days later, sometimes I couldn't see much difference at all, even though I knew this trail was much older now. And it made me start to question myself on every sign that I saw of deer and question my assumptions about how old things are and just how much I can actually see even many days after the deer passes by. This gets further complicated when you realize that different substrates have different capacity for holding tracks and different timelines for aging. So if you're following a trail that starts out in the mud of a well-used run, and then you follow it into an oak forest, and then it goes into a poplar woods, each of those substrates have their own timelines and ways that they react to the elements like heat, cold, sun, and rain. We need to anticipate which parts of the forest are most likely to show tracks and which parts of the forest where we should not expect to see tracks, because that is really what helps us get to the point where we're able to follow deer trails in conditions that would never be possible if we only relied on what we can physically see. So there's a point on the tracking journey when we start to push up against the limitations of our physical senses. This is a great example where we have a nice deer trail moving through a section of leaf litter, but then very quickly the trail goes into this low-growing woody shrub ground cover, and suddenly those deer tracks get way more difficult to see. I don't think I've ever been able to see a track in this type of substrate unless it was really perfect conditions, like first thing in the morning with dew everywhere and a nice fresh trail. So this is where we need to use speculative tracking, the ingenuity of the human brain to actually hypothesize on where the most likely direction is and where is the most likely place for the next track. So we know they're moving through this patch of leaves. We know the general direction they've been following so far. We can't see tracks in this woody stuff, but what about over in the next patch of leaves? Very often, if you go check in the next section where it switches back to leaf litter, you can find that trail again. And using this combination of deductive tracking and speculation, you work your way through a patchwork landscape and gradually improve your ability to see tracks in a wider variety of substrates. But even more importantly, you learn how to follow deer even if you can't see any tracks for long stretches of time by relying on your knowledge of deer behavior, track substrates, and local understanding of how the deer use that specific landscape. I just think this whole process of tracking is one of the most fascinating tests of human intelligence and awareness that has ever existed in our time as humans evolving alongside this amazing world. The crazy thing is that I know I've only just scratched the surface and there's a lot more to discover. So if you want to join me as we keep learning about these deer and other cool animals, subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.